Hello and welcome to Courageous Conversations with Heman, where we dive into big ideas and bold actions driving social change. I'm your host, Heman, Research and Communications Coordinator at South Asia Research Institute for Minorities. I'm also juggling with my postgrad in the social innovation and entrepreneurship at the London School of Economics and Political Science. So you know I'm all about turning ideas into impact. Today, I'm absolutely thrilled to chat with Sneha. She's a lecturer in the business ethics at Monash University, whose underbreaking work on caste, gender, and equalities is shaking up. We think about the organization and society. From her award-winning PhD on challenging gendered violence in India to her powerful research on caste is an invisible force in the workplaces. Sneha's insights are must-have for anyone passionate about justice and inclusion, just like me. Without any further ado, let's dive into a conversation that's for sure to inspire anyone passionate about making organizations and societies more fairer and just. Sneha, it's honestly a pleasure to connect with you as a management student from the LSE and you leading the charge at Moksha. I really appreciate your journey from real estate to hospitality to researching caste and gender inequalities, which is so inspiring. I would like to know that was there any pivotal moment in your industry days that made you to pure to management research? And how does that experience still shape the way you approach business ethics in work today?
Heman, it's so great that I could talk to you finally, and talk about the work that I do, the research and teaching, especially when we talk about justice and inclusion in the workplace and in organizations. So, I'm really thrilled that I can talk to you about it, and as part of SARIM as well. So I am, as you mentioned, I'm Dr. Sneha Chrispal from Monash University. So I had a very peculiar journey to, doing research on marginalized groups, particularly caste and gender. It wasn't very straightforward. So I started with a bachelor's in marketing communications. And then, I moved to the US. I grew up in India, but, my parents came from a lower middle class family and, but they always emphasized the importance of education throughout my life and, how important it is for, us to be educated. And they spent a lot of time, precious, capital, as we say, to make sure that we were educated. And then, I moved to the US for my bachelor's, and that again was a happenstance, scholarship, etc., to be able to do that. And then, a family incident made me come back right after my bachelor's, and I was really thinking about what I wanted to do. And this was 2008, and we had the economic crisis. There weren't many jobs that were available at that time. And so I decided, I, again, how networks work in India.
Yeah.
And so I had this opportunity and I got this opportunity to work in real estate. I had no clue about it and, what it entailed, etc. But I started off in sales and there was something around me, right? I was one of two girls among 14 men in the sales department, right? And you see that in a lot of, whether it's real estate and a lot of other things, when you're in the sales department, you see that demographic, right? There's a lot of men and you are probably like one or two women because it entails you going out, meeting people, doing a lot of cold calls, things like that, right? And working late hours, which, as you know, a lot of families aren't comfortable with, women going out and staying out late, etc. And so that was my first instance of seeing that, right? Like, what's going on? Why isn't, this space inclusive for everyone and women especially? And then, I worked in real estate for a long time. I was in hospitality, working in hotel sales, then got back into real estate. And, I really wanted to do marketing because I was educated in marketing and communications and all of that. And then, I fell in love with it, but I always really realized that, my heart was somewhere else. And so I decided, again, through conversations, again, networking, we got this opportunity to do a master's in New York in organizational leadership. And as I was having conversation, I started developing this love for research during that time. And so I and I was thinking about, where I wanted to do my research. And I was like, oh, I worked in real estate, might as well do my research in that thing. And I was just looking back in India. And so I went back to India, did my research there in the real estate company on adaptability and resilience, what makes people adaptable and resilient even in this face of chaos, etc., right? Even when times get tough in the workplace, etc. But something that really kept coming up was how men and women kind of face resilience and adaptability very differently. And so that kind of, was in the back of my head, was in the center of my research. And then I finished my research and I finished my degree. And, I had this amazing mentor, Dr. Underwood, and she really pushed me, really made me fall in love with research. And when I went back, I started real estate again. I told the company I would work for them again. But then I just was like, no, this is not keeping me happy. And so I decided I wanted to do a PhD, and I did. And so I thought I really wanted to do it on gender and gendered violence specifically, because we know the global statistics, but especially if you've grown up in India and as a woman, 1 in 3 women face violence, right? A lot of us have already faced gendered violence in some form in India, in our everyday life. And so that really was, the moment that I thought, this is something that I wanted to pick on, but really think about how organizations can become these pivotal sort of social actors and be able to make change and disrupt gendered violence in this space. And so that's what I wanted to do. And so I pursued my PhD at the University of Melbourne. But apart from gendered violence, I had these discussions about caste, right? The topic of caste kept coming up. And that was what I wanted to focus on as well. So I think gendered violence was one, kind of, if you think about a Venn diagram, was one thing. And the other was caste, because it was coming up in a lot of the conversations that I had. I really had a passion for it because I saw it every day, right? In our workplace, outside of it, in our everyday life in India. And so I really wanted to think about how organizations and all of that. But that really came from my discussions with Professor Hari Bapuji, who's been, a pivotal part and mentor in my life, in particularly my research on caste. And so, he really helped and encouraged and supported me as well to do that research. And, he does a lot of research in caste, in management and organization studies and business. So that was where I think we really wanted to lead those discussions on caste and management.
That's such a diverse experience, Sneha, and that's also fascinating perspective on how your industry background informs your research now. Speaking of your work, your 2020 Journal of Business Ethics paper on economic inequality through the lens of caste really hit home for me, specifically with my work at SARIM and also the G4 communities discriminated on work and dissent. Can you share a real world example from that research that shows how caste shape access to opportunities in modern organizations? Maybe something that might catch our listeners off guard.
Okay, so I can explain it in just a quick summary in terms of, what that paper was talking about. So it was about, how endowment of productive resources like economic capital, cultural capital, and social capital have an impact on access to productive resources like, we know, education, our basic needs like just shelter, food, etc., and health, which then also kind of affects our returns to productive resources, right? So the kinds of compensation we get, the rents, the mobility, employability, and so forth, right? And so the caste system, we know, restricts this whole economic system, right? So we know that some castes have access to, these productive resources, some do not. So let me just give you an example. So we see this today in, if we take, for example, economic capital or social capital, right? So if you have access to networks or you have access to compensation, right? You have economic capital, you're able to, have access to education. So for Dalits, that is not the truth, right? Dalits have the highest or higher illiteracy rates as compared to other castes in, the caste hierarchy. And so they don't have access. So if they don't have that social capital, they don't have that economic capital, they might not have access to education, right? So they're forced, for example, to take up jobs as sanitation workers. As we know, they make up, the predominantly the dirty work, right? There's a lot of work in management, for example, that focuses on this. So Dalits taking up jobs like sanitation workers, becoming cleaners, janitors, and then right. So these are their resources and opportunities, and then that affects their productive resources, right? Their compensation. So they're compensated not very well. They have low wages. They have lack of job security. They have lack of mobility. And then if you don't have that, if you have lower compensation, again, it's like a cyclical thing, right? You don't have higher economic capital. Again, lower education. So it's like this real vicious, insidious cycle that affects different communities in different ways.
Yeah, it also reminds me of your organization studies piece, where you argue that staying silent on caste in management research makes us complicit. You know, as someone studying social innovation at the Department of Management, I'm just curious to build on that. What one practical step as we management scholars can take to break the silence and make our field more inclusive, especially for the marginalized and underprivileged communities?
So I think a major thing for me it was, I remember being told when I was doing caste research, for example, in the beginning by a lot of scholars, oh, this is going to restrict you. You're going to be ostracized if you do this research, or you might be pushed into a niche, right? People might not think whatever you'd be known as only a caste scholar, right? Or you might not be able to publish in certain journals. And that kind of scared me in a way. I think a big part of this is courage and bravery in the scholarship that we do. Like we talked about complicity in ignoring caste. If we don't speak up, things are not going to change, right? And that has always been like my motto in some sense is that we need to speak up. If you don't dialogue, if you don't talk about these things, don't write about it in our research, things are not going to change, right? We can blame a lot of things, right? So, for example, I like, there's this paper by Arun Kumar Hari Bapuji. It's in the Journal of Business Ethics on, Ambedkar's work. They said something, and it's quoted, the first order of business then for the principal researcher and organizational activist is to reframe the debate, right? That we need to contest this position that rising inequalities are an inevitable consequence of industrial growth. We always blame industrial growth and expansion, globalization as the reason why inequalities are rising up. But is that the truth, right? Like, can we position in that way? But instead, what we need to do is we need to, like they mentioned, re-enfranchise the subaltern or those people that don't really, the marginalized communities, the minorities, for example. Like, how do we create spaces in academia and scholarship for people to speak into dialogue or for people to, so we're not necessarily only being scholars, but in some way we're creating spaces for these dialogues for I don't like to use the word protesting, but challenging and contesting these dominant views about business and management, etc. Right? We need to create spaces where we can talk about minorities and marginalization and so forth. And we're seeing that in a lot of journals now. A lot of special issues. Recently, there's a Business and Society special issue on caste and business. There's an Academy of Management Review journal, which is that is talking about marginalization. And so we see suddenly that there's these spaces and these topics are becoming, more prevalent, and people want to talk about that and look at these through different prisms and ways of thinking and doing. And I think that's what's important.
Yeah, and I love that idea. I mean, it is so actionable for our academia community. And let's talk about your PhD work. I mean, which challenges gendered violence in the remote Indian village, and which won you the William Prize. And it feels like a natural extension of the push for inclusion. Can you take us back to a moment from your field work that shifted your perspective, how communities resist systematic inequalities? And for those of us thinking about social and entrepreneurship, what's a key lesson we can take away from that?
Sure. I think there's two interconnected sort of anecdotes that I can kind of talk about. So one was when I did my research in this particular area in Gujarat, right? So this is a lot of villages nearby, etc. It's a lot of very there's you can see there's a hierarchy, a caste hierarchy, right? A lot of the women face tremendous violence, right? It is a society where child marriage is a big issue. So girls are married off at a very young age. There's practices of sata. So sata is the exchange of marriage. So to keep families or people in marriage or couples in marriage, what they do is they get the brother and sister married to another brother and sister, right? So within the families, the elders dictate how the marriage is conducted. If there are problems, they intervene and make sure that you're still staying, even if there's violence, right, involved, and so forth. And so this was a very I'd call it a very intense and highly charged context. And so we were going through a village, and this organization that I was, working with, or I was researching with, they connect to a lot of social actors. So whether it's legislation, political actors, caste leaders, village leaders, panchayats, and so forth. And so when they do a lot of workshops with, children, right, from different castes, etc. So one of the workshops was with the Dalit girls, right, in this angan, what we call a courtyard. And so we were going through the village, and this was, a new one that they were trying, and they couldn't figure out where the angan was or where we were going to have this workshop with these Dalit girls. And so we were driving along, and we stopped to ask for directions. And the person who, we asked directions from said, why do you want to go there? That's where the Harijans live, and Harijans are, the untouchables, and you know this from back when. But why do you want to go there? There's only garbage there, right? And so that was the first sort of in your face moment that I had. That was very confronting for me because I knew that caste existed, but for people to still have those views, I think, and to continuously say that was hard for me. But then when I went there, I just saw those girls hugging me, and the smiles on their faces, and they were just like me, right? I just saw a reflection of who I was in them, because they just were human. And that's something that they kept continuously say, that other people don't want to touch us, they don't want to come near us, and because they're considered untouchable, right? So that was one of the first kind of confrontations, very hard thing to wrap my head around. Another, I think what the organization did specifically was try to find ways, subtle ways of changing the way even children, because we're socialized, right? So from a young age, if you're taught that you're an upper caste person, you need to do certain things a certain way, you cannot interact with people from the lower caste, you cannot touch them, you cannot do certain things. But they did it very subtly, right? So for example, they used to hold these workshops for these children in the temple, right? So temple sometimes, and a lot of times, I mean, then a lot of Dalits aren't allowed to enter, but they used to have these workshops and take special permission and have these workshops there. And then what we used to find is that everyone used to, the upper caste children would sit closer to the banners in the front, right, where the front was. And what she would do was change the banners and move it towards the back where the, Dalit children used to sit. And that used to be the new front, right? And so that's subtle ways that the organization was trying to change, the ways that these would, and she used to do it with gender as well, right? So the boys used to sit in front and change the banner so that girls could sit in front. So these were the certain ways that she was changing, I don't like to say, the minds of these children, but at least showing them that, everyone is equal in some way and form. And I think that's so important. And something that really struck me about this organization and, is the embeddedness in the community, is using the community to really change these perspectives and educating, say, the leaders, the political leaders, the caste leaders, to really think about, the way that they, treat their women, for example. And so I think that is what the organization is, to be embedded in the community. And I think that's really one way that we can do, or we can, one way that social change happens, right? If we can be embedded in some way or form.
So that's such a, eye opener for think when you think about the systematic change. Thank you for sharing it, and it also ties to your point about caste being deeply embodied and linked to sacred norms, which makes it so complex to tackle. Building on that, uh, again, can you share an example of how this embedded nature of caste shows up in today's workplace? Let's say in the corporate offices or the startups. and what it means for those us working to create a fairer organizations.
Sure. I think I've read so many research papers, especially because of our annals paper. But I can pick a couple that I think just resonate, because we know that caste is becoming increasingly pervasive in places outside of South Asia, right? So we know that now we're having recent cases in the US, in Silicon Valley, the Cisco case, for example, or in the UK, there's multiple case studies being done there. There's one by Metcalf and Rolfe that talk about that share multiple case studies on caste in the United Kingdom. We know that it's in Australia, and but so many other places. So one example, I remember there was, I think it was in one of the, I think, articles that I read, especially the news articles, where I think, especially in Silicon Valley, where, one of the, I think this person was from the lower caste, and he mentioned how, one of the upper caste colleagues used to rub his hand on your shoulder to see whether you're wearing a puna, right? So, or the red sacred thread that you're meant to wear as an upper caste, because you go through the, these ceremonies and ritual ceremonies and so forth. And so that was one way of identifying whether you were upper caste or not, right? Like I said, it is deeply embodied, because these are the ways that it's represented, right? There's these notions about purity and pollution, right? When we talk about caste, so if you're upper caste, you're thought to be a lot purer. If you're from the lower caste, you tend to be associated with pollution, right? So, for example, there's a paper, Thomas 2020, where he talks about, for example, this is in an Indian Institute of Science, and so they talked about how there were separate cafeterias, right? There's a vegetarian cafeteria, and there's a mixed cafeteria that you go to, because there's clearly a delineation between the spaces, even in the organizations, for what is pure and what is impure, right? And so you see these things, right, happening. Or even if people always scrutinizing you while you're eating, right, for your eating habits. Are you eating pure vegetarian food? Because there's this understanding that if you are eating pure vegetarian food, you're sattvic, you're upper caste, etc. But if you're not, you're definitely, you might be from the lower caste, right? So there's these different assumptions, but we see these even happening in organizations everywhere else, right? And so you might be, if you think about it, so this is how, when we were talking previously about social capital, right? So social networks within the organization, if you're found out, for example, that you're lower caste, you might be shunned from these social networks. You might not have mobility. They might prevent you from succeeding in your career or moving upwards, like the Cisco case, right? And so we see this manifesting in multiple ways in organizations as such.
This really highlights the challenges that we face as a management scholars. Since you teach business ethics and organization behavior, I'm curious to know how you bring these complex ideas to life. I have a module of organizational behavior, but we did not cover such things like how caste should be, challenged or behaved in an organization. I would like to know from your perspective that how we can apply these big theories to real world problem, and how do you help your students to connect decolonial or institutional theories to issues like caste and gender. Any memorable classroom moment where a student had a real breakthrough.
Yeah, sure. So I am, I really like to think about how, think about decolonizing theories or even methodologies, right, in the way that I, use it in my teaching approach. So I'm all about relationality, right? Like I want students to understand how, especially when we talk, because I teach business ethics, right? So how can we think about, different, say, ethical problems in the world through a perspective where we can think about relationality? So between, a lot of times we just think about stakeholders, but how do we relate to one another? How do we think about the effects of ethical problems to even the marginalized groups, right? Who might be at a distance if you think about it. And so something that I do, I really try to think of innovative ways. I think I'm innovative in one sense, but I think try to think of innovative ways that I can educate students, especially because, some students might not be exposed to these things or they don't think about it, right? Because we think about mainstream management and, like you mentioned, organizational behavior, right? But how can we kind of stretch them to think and reflect and be reflexive of how, they are positioned in the world? So one of the things that I do, for example, is they have an assessment where they need to tell a story. They need to tell a story about their life. So, using decolonizing methodologies of storytelling. So I've, left it open to them to, they can tell their story through art. They can tell their story through song, right? But what are they telling their story about? So this is, I really want them to reflect on how their position, so their social identity, right? Maybe their gender, it might be, their ability, it might be, their race, ethnicity, these multiple social identities that we have, how can they impact, the way we make decisions, business decisions, ethical, everyday decisions, right? So I make them tell their story about how their social identities have developed over time. So, is it people, for example, I always use this example, even when teaching my students, if you're, when I was young, as in India, I was continuously told by people like me, you can't stay out at night, right? It goes back to the first thing that I said. And so we're socialized to that, right? Throughout our lives, that you're a woman, you can't stay out. But like my brothers could stay out till whatever time, but I had to be back home, right? Because it's not safe for women. So something like that, right? So we're being socialized. So when I grew up, I knew I wanted to challenge this, right? Like I took up sales and I would stay out late and work. But then that was something that, helped me change my way of thinking in the workplace. So how did I create spaces for women to feel safe in the workplace, right? And so that's what I want from my students. Like how can they reflect on their own lives, and how do those social identities afford them certain privileges or marginalization, right? So I think that's one way to really push them and encourage them, not push them, but encourage them to think about where they are positioned in society, and right, how does that help them make those business decisions that they need to later on in life, right? They need to think about or place themselves in comparison to other people that might not have, right, when we're talking about minorities and marginalized groups. And so that's one way that I try to do that. So I really like the stories that they tell me. Students have written songs for me, and drawn art to explain those stories, and I think that really helps them communicate things that they might not otherwise communicate. I think I've also developed, for example, a snakes and ladders game, that helps them understand, marginalization and privilege in multiple ways. And so I think that's really important, right? How can we make these kind of theories and ways of, what we want to teach and research and, want management students to know in ways that are accessible and fun, and, are ways that can also kind of help us avoid, AI. So those are the things that I have in the back of my mind when I want to, use the teaching approaches that I do.
So there is a very, it's a big community in Department of Management at LSE, but nobody, I mean, really talks about the casteism for the minorities, how people are, I mean, treated in the workplaces. So this is where I have to share something with
Sure.
you, that at SARIM, I have been documenting caste discrimination in Pakistan for almost 4 years, whether it is a human rights violation, working with communities on ground. What I find is that there is a silence, there is a denial, the same coded exclusion. But when I came to LSE, focus has shifted. Now I'm exploring how we can empower, Dalit women, or whether it's the bonded labor from Dalit communities in Pakistan, because that's where caste hits hard. This is the labor. I have to fight for their dignity. This is the basic right. So I'm just curious, seriously thinking about taking the PhD into it, researching caste across South Asian diaspora, the mechanism of discrimination, the resistance movements emerging globally. So I wanted to ask you this, that as someone who has navigated academia and research on this issue, what would you suggest? How do we balance rigorous research with the urgency of what's happening on ground, and what gaps do you think that it still need to be filled?
Yeah, there was something that, I was always told, and I think it's really important to remember is when we get into academia, I think when you just write, I think there's always this pressure. What kind of change are we making? Are we, just doing our research, using, using whatever we've gathered, the research, the data, the people that we engage with, and then we just, just hash out these papers. But I think it's more than that, right? I think it's also important to remember that through academia, you're being a voice to the papers that you write, right? By writing these papers, a lot more people are reading them, right? And I think that's really important. And we need to really think about also that how we can use just our research in multiple ways, right? Like you said, you're doing a podcast, which is amazing, right? And so can we make our research accessible through other avenues? I think that's also very important. So I don't think that there should be a pressure on, like, yes, I need to do that. Like, I need to engage with this and I need to do this. But I think what we really need to do is, and especially in academia, I think, especially when you're in your PhD, as I mentioned before, when we were having conversation about, I think the PhD is a great time because you have the time to do the research that you need to. I think take that time to do the research that you are passionate about, and do it in a way, yes, you have time to write the papers at the end and your thesis and all of that, but take the time to actually embed yourself again in the context and do the research that you want to be able to then think about the output, right? And I think, and don't put that pressure on yourself to, that we need to churn out certain amount of papers and all of that. I think, social change will happen. I think it will happen in, just through writing. And dialogue, like we mentioned, creating spaces for that, like you are through these podcasts, and so forth. I think there is multiple ways that we can do this and make our research more accessible to, the wider community. I hope I
Yeah,
answered your question.
yeah. I totally agree with that. Since we wrap up, last question would be, since your work bridges the gap between the management theory and real world challenge on the caste and gender specifically and the inequalities, which is so motivating. Looking ahead, what's one big challenge or opportunity you see for the management to collaborate on tackling these systematic issues? And what advice would you share with me or our listeners to keep driving change in South Asia or beyond?
Sure. I think like the research that we do, I think, that I've done so far, I think is just a drop in the ocean. There's so much that needs to be done. I think we need so many more researchers, scholars to want to do this research, right? Like I said, it takes courage, it takes bravery, it takes a lot of effort. Like I say, it's a lot of mental work, emotional work that you do to be able to do this work, and it's not for the faint-hearted. Like, to be honest, because I mean, like any researcher, I'm not just talking about just our research that we do. Yes, but there's like for any researcher to publish, we have that pressure, right? The pressure to publish so that we can get to a certain point in academia. But when you're doing work with the marginalized communities, and doing research on the marginalized, for example, there's so much more. There's more layers to it, right? There's those pressures. Are we doing justice to their voices in our research and through our research? I think that's also something that we need to think about. I think one advice would be, take immense care when you do this research. I think that's important, and I've learned that the hard way in a lot of ways is, sometimes you just need to distance yourself from this research and take breaks, and give yourself that grace to be able to also stand back and then get back into it, right? And so I think that's what I would tell you too is, it's always great to do this research. It's much needed research, but also it's very important to have that self care as well to do this research.
Yeah, of course, I totally agree with you on this. We have to, understand the, community is going through. So I will be traveling to Cape Town this month to do in-field research with a community. South African communities, Langa community over there. So they have been facing discrimination like this. Uh, Isna, honestly, this chat, the session has blown away my mind, and I loved your energy, honestly. And thank you very much for bringing so much wisdom and heart to this podcast. As someone studying management, I'm taking notes on how one can weave decolonial and institutional theories into tackling caste and gender inequalities. It's like another masterclass of my own research. Your insights on how business can move beyond performative fixes to create a real exclusion are going to stick with me forever. And I know our listeners are fired up with this conversation. Thank you very much, Sneha, for taking your time off for this conversation. And it was real insightful to have a one-to-one conversation with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Heman, again for like letting me have this conversation with you.